Welcome, everybody. My name is Don Bailey. I'm chair of the Fellows Program here at RTI International, and welcome to the next in our continuing series of seminars and lectures sponsored by the Fellows Program. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Joe Palca today. A lot of times people say this person really needs no introduction. I think really it's probably true about Joe. As everyone knows here, he's a science correspondent with NPR. He's been with NPR since 1992, and if you listen to NPR, which I'm sure most of you do, you realize he covers quite a wide range of topics on science. He also clearly thinks a lot about the relationship between science and the media, both how they work independently, but how they ought to be and sometimes don't interact together. He has a science background himself. He has a PhD in psychology from the University of Santa Cruz, University of California, Santa Cruz. Well, I couldn't do this without telling my own NPR story, my 11 words of fame. So when I first came to RTI, this was about 10 years ago, I'd been here for about a month, and I got a call from NPR asking me to do an interview. There had been a story that had recently come out in a journal describing the benefits of early childhood education. Well, I'd be kind of angry about all this because we've been trying to prove this for 40 years. I said, sure, I'll do this interview. And so you had about 10 minutes before they could actually call me and do it. So I thought I'd had a lot of media training. So I thought very quickly, now how am I going to do this interview? So I remembered, first of all, you have to be short and crisp in your answers. You have to remember what your talking points are. Don't give all the nuances of everything about the study. And try to think of something memorable to say so that it might get you actually quoted on the radio. So I did that. I thought about all those things. And so I thought, well, what can I say that's memorable? And I said, well, I came up with something like, we don't need brain science to prove that we need to do something good for children. And I practiced that, and I thought, well, this is going to be it. So we did the interview. They talked to me about the study and so forth, and I was able to weave that in there. So at the end, they said, thank you, Dr. Bailey, for interviewing us. And I thought the tape recorder was off then. So then I saying, well, thank you so much for doing this interview and for the story. It's really important to continue to highlight the importance of early childhood education. Said a few other things. And then at the end, I said, no one ever asks if second grade is worth it. And so the next morning, I get up, I'm driving into work, I'm listening to the radio, and my 11 words were there. And you can remember which 11 they were. No one ever asked if second grade is really worth it. So, the title of his talk, although it looks like it's my talk, it's supposed to be Science and News, a Marriage of Convenience. I actually think it might be speed dating, but we'll find out for sure. So please join me in welcoming Joe Palca.
Thanks very much. My name is Joe Palca. I'm a reporter with NPR, formerly known as National Public Radio. Typically, when I give a talk, I try to do it without notes in a relaxed manner, speaking off the cuff, as it were. It's a style I found works well for me. But I have found that using PowerPoint can help me communicate my ideas, help me make my points more effectively, help me engage my audience. So I decided to give it a try. What do you think so far? Okay. I just love doing that. That's for people who've seen one too many PowerPoint presentations. Thank you all very much for having me and coming in. Don's introduction of here's someone who needs no introduction is reminded me of a story that I'll share with you now about my most terrifying moment in radio. I was a fill-in host for Talk of the Nation, not Science Friday, but Talk of the Nation, which was a 2-hour-long call-in show. And it's really a three-ring circus to host a call-in show, because you sit in the studio, and you have a director sitting on the other side of a glass partition who's watching clocks and things like that to tell you when to start speaking. And then there's a producer who's actually paying attention to the content of the program and making sure that the subjects are flowing along properly. And then there's a call screener who's sitting at a computer answering the phone and typing in a précis of the questions that people are calling in with, so you don't get some nut job on the radio, which you still get sometimes. I can tell you that story too. Anyway, so and in front of you, not only do you have a microphone and these two people that you have to watch and your headphones where they're talking to you in your ear, and you have a screen in front of you where you're seeing the précis of the person who's just talked to you, who's grabbing the phone calls, and you have to punch the button to call up the next call. And you have to talk to the person that you're interviewing. You have to pay attention to all these things and not sound like you don't know what's happening. So on this particular day, the first section in the program was the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, who had just returned from Darfur and was in Khartoum. And we were having him on the show, I don't remember his name, to talk about the refugee crisis. So I start the program, I tell everybody what we're doing, I give the call-in number, I say, and joining us now is so-and-so from Khartoum, and he says about 3 words and the line goes dead. He's on a cell phone from Khartoum, and so I said, well, we're having some technical difficulties, I'm sure we'll get him back, we're talking, and I'm just doing boilerplate at this point. Call us, our number is 800-855-1299, and this is a problem, and he's been there, and this is such a... But we're not getting the line back. I'm seeing people in the control room scurrying around and pressing buttons. So I look over to the producer, and she's disappeared. And I look over at the call screener, and she's disappeared. And I look at the screen, and the lights are lighting up, but I don't know what any of the calls are asking or anything like that. And I'm thinking, okay, how long can I do this for? And then it got worse. Because back into the room with the producer sits comes the producer of the show with a reporter. And it's the NPR reporter who's been covering Khartoum and this crisis, covering Sudan and this crisis in Darfur. The problem is I couldn't remember her name. And the producer's about to bring her into the studio to sit down and talk with me to fill the time. So I have someone to talk to, and I can't remember her name. And I go, oh my, so I actually, what I did was I played back, I knew who it was, and she was the former Moscow correspondent, and she always used to SOC, which is which stands for Standard Out Cue. It's the end of the piece where you say, I'm Joe Palca. She always used to say it in a very familiar way. She'd say, Michelle Kellerman, NPR News, Moscow. And I remembered, oh, it's Michelle Kellerman. And then the line came back up, and I was able to talk to but I was saying to Richard Harris, who's my colleague on the science desk, what would I have done? Because I couldn't remember her name. What if I hadn't been able to fish it out? And he said, well, you could have just said, and now I'm joined by my colleague who needs no introduction. So there's always a way around a problem. But that was the most terrified I've ever been in live broadcasting, because I didn't come up with Richard's solution on the spot. Okay, so what I'm going to, as you saw, the title of the talk, what I'd like to talk to you today about is science and news, and how they have some difficulty going in the same format sometimes. And so I thought I'd walk you through some of the reasons I believe that, and then end up with some of the conclusions I've come to about what we can do about it, which unfortunately I can get to the chase. There's not much we can do about it. The formats just don't coincide very well. But here's what I'd like to do. This is the audience participation part of the piece. So, what are the big news stories of 2016? Not science. I'm just talking about big news stories. Stories that if NPR or New York Times or somebody had failed to cover these stories, they look like idiots. So anybody, big news, Trump, election, okay, what else?
Syria.
House Bill 2. Syria?
Syria.
Oh, Syria. Oh. Syria. No, that's science. We're not going to science yet. Well, anyway, the point I think is that here's a list I made up. So today, Egyptian airliner, we're pretty close, HB2, Brussels terror attack, U.S. presidential election, Justice Scalia's death, Supreme Court in Panama. No problem. It's a no-brainer to come up with a list like this. And nobody would disagree, I don't think, that although we could talk about how much attention we're paying to the Egyptian airliner crash and whether that's really representative of how big a risk that is for people's transportation decision-making, but nobody would disagree that these are big stories and that a reputable news organization should cover them. So then the question is, what are the big science news stories of 2016? Don's already offered Zika, and I say that doesn't count because that's last year's story. No, I'll give you Zika. It's still a big story. What else? Bingo. What else? I love doing this because this is a smart audience and they're thinking hard. And transplants? Oh, yes. Big science news. Yeah. Well, I did a story about the inflatable module that they're attaching to the International Space Station. Maybe it's the year for things that grow. I don't know. Well, here's the list I came up with. You all remember Inky the octopus that crawled out of and went down a storm drain and tried to get it? Anyway, my point is, and it's a serious one, is that while we don't have any trouble coming up with a list of big news stories, big science just doesn't happen that often. That's not to say, and I'm going to get again. I'll cut to the end of the piece right now and tell you that's not to say there aren't a fantastic number of interesting science stories out there, and some are really important. But the ability to fit them into a news format, I'm arguing, is awkward because they don't go. And what happens as a consequence is when we do a story about a transplant or a new, I don't know, I could pick up today's Science magazine and tell you that we're going to cover a new feathered dinosaur or something like that. It begins to sound like that's as important as a Scalia replacement on the Supreme Court or HB2 or social, and so you distort what science really is. And so here's the other problem. I don't know what's big science news, and I don't think anybody else does either. And here's why I argue that. So this is the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2010. It was awarded to Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoselov. Now, how many people in the room know what graphene is? Okay, so graphene is a new form of carbon. It was discovered by these guys, and it's such a compelling story because they basically put some Scotch tape on a carbon pencil and pulled it off, and they wound up with a monolayer of carbon atoms, which has this really remarkable properties that they're conductors, but it's a new form of carbon, very exciting, hasn't quite transformed the world the way people thought it would originally, but that's okay. Now, let me tell you one of the jobs that we do know is news. Every year, the Nobel Prizes get announced in Stockholm in October. Monday is physiology or medicine. Tuesday is physics, and Wednesday is chemistry. I usually get stuck with chemistry. I only say it that way because usually this year was particularly compelling. The Monday award went to Bob Edwards for in vitro fertilization, so that was reasonably easy to discuss. The second day was this Andrei Geim and Novoselov with graphene. That was pretty easy. And the third day was the Hecht reaction, which was a palladium-catalyzed cross-coupling reaction in organic chemistry. And what happens is you come in at 5:30 in the morning, you keep refreshing the Nobel website, and at 5:45 they pop up with the name of the Nobel Prize winner, and something about a press release that's tailored for a lay audience, and also a press release tailored for a science audience that describes the work. And I have to tell you, for the heck reaction, it wasn't very helpful. I mean, it's a little bit helpful. But, and then, and this is the part that shows you that it takes a lot to burn out your embarrassment circuits. At 5:45, you learn about this Nobel Prize, which is completely impenetrable, and at 6:30, you go on the air live for 5 minutes explaining it to America. And if you don't think you have to have confidence, try it sometime. Anyway, so as I said, the Nobel Prize is a very, it used to be we wait for a fax at the Swedish embassy. That was how it used to be done. But now it's much easier, and they do put out these press releases. And so one of the things that was in the press release was this reference. So remember, it's the 2010 Nobel Prize, and the paper that first described this electric field effect in anatomically thin carbon films came out in 2004. Now, another thing you have to understand about the way science correspondence, people say, how do you get your stories? Well, one of the ways is I get a copy, in my mailbox this morning was the table of contents for this week's Science magazine. So I know all the stories that are going to be published on Thursday, but they're under embargo, which means I'm not allowed to tell you or report on them. Although if one of them was about Zika and I wanted an expert opinion, I could send it to Don. Don could give me a comment, but I just wouldn't be able to broadcast that. It's important you understand that. Some people think, oh, I can't talk to you at all. No, you can talk to me. You just can't. I just can't broadcast it. And it's a great system. We can talk about the pluses and minuses, but it gives us a leg up. The idea being, instead of being slammed at 2 o'clock by 10 stories in science and having to decide which one's important and which one's not and getting comments, we have 3 days or 4 days to sort it out and get it. So I was working at NPR in 2004, and I know that I got the table of contents this week, and I know that all my colleagues in the rest of the news media did. And this is a story that appeared in Science, and it was such an important discovery that it justified a Nobel Prize 6 years later, right? So I thought, oh, okay, well, I wonder what story I did when I saw that very important paper. And these are the only people I could find who said anything about it. Now, I'm going to explain a little bit about why this group is even larger than I was expecting. New Scientist is a British science journal. These guys were working at the University of Manchester in England, and so they put out a press release. It was sort of local news for them. It was still pretty smart that they had it. And that Manchester Evening News down at the bottom, that's not Manchester, New Hampshire, that's Manchester, England. And that was where the work was done. The others I'm a little less clear about. Electronic Weekly, I don't even know if that's still going. Extreme Tech Com, I don't know. Investors Business Day, I mean, maybe they're just better at it than me. It's probably not, that's not hard. But anyway, my point here is, went sailing past Joe Palca, that giant of the journalism world, and all my friends at New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Time, Newsweek, CBS, none of us got it. And the reason is, I think, that we don't know. I mean, there might have been, well, so here's another one just to prove my point. Oh, I also wanted to make the point that nobody missed it when it won the Nobel Prize. It wasn't like we don't get it at all. It's just we didn't get it when it was news. And the problem is you can't go in and say, hey, I've got some great news about a discovery 4 years ago or 6 years ago, because editors hate that. So here's the other one. A programmable dual RNA-guided DNA endonuclease and adaptive bacterial immunity. So who knows what this is referring to? Yes, right. CRISPR-Cas9. Have you all heard of CRISPR-Cas9? So I'm standing here before you on Monday, May 23rd, 2016. This will win a Nobel Prize. It hasn't yet. It has won a lot of other prizes. It may take a while, but only because there's a big patent fight between Berkeley and Broad Institute and MIT about who actually found it first. But I know it was Jennifer Doudna because she went to Pomona like I did. So that's how we make decisions. And I can sing I was very impressive because I was able to sing the Pomona fight song, if you want to hear it. But that's maybe for later. Anyway, so once again, this paper came out in 2012. And CRISPR, even if it hasn't yet won the Nobel Prize, it has already transformed biological research not beyond recognition, but enormously, and it will continue to, because what it is, it's a system for editing genes in situ, basically. So you can take a living cell, put in this CRISPR-Cas9 with a particular change that you want to make in a particular gene, and the CRISPR-Cas9 will go to that spot in the genome, pluck out the sequence that you want and add something in, or just remove it, or you can do pretty much what you want. And if you want to talk about gene therapy, oh, we can fix a gene? Yeah, you can do that. Oh, gene knockout? Yeah, we can do that. And can you do it in any animal, or does it just have to be a model organism that we've studied for years and years? No, you can do it in any organism, and it's just fantastically important. So once again, 2012, again, Joe Palca and the other brilliant science journalists. Here's the two things I could find. This is a Nexus search looking for CRISPR and Doudna, because this is the paper. State News Service. And that's because Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory and University of Georgia both put out press releases about this, and state news services just tend to pick them up. So I'm not sure that state news service actually, that put it out onto a feed to smaller newspapers, but I wasn't able to find any newspapers that actually picked up the article. So this is just people who were subscribing to state news services, which is a fairly small and select group of people, and Future Microbiology, which I don't know. Does anybody know what Future Microbiology is? I never heard of them. But God bless them, they figured out that this is an important story. So I'm only saying that because 2012, it's now 2016, completely revolutionized biology. Who knew? So the good news is I now feel released from trying to figure out what's important, because I know I'm probably going to be wrong. I did just on that basis, I did a story about the discovery of a Frank Casper sigma phase in sphere-forming block copolymer melts. And I only did the story because I didn't understand a single word in the title. But I went back to the author, and I've gotten to know him, so I actually wound up choosing a pretty good one. And I said, do you think this work could win the Nobel Prize? And I think he was a little startled. But my question was, is this so obscure and so important that it might win a Nobel Prize 10 years from now? And I think his answer was, I hope so. Okay, so now I've begun to explain to you, I think, this is my thesis anyway, that it's impossible, or very difficult, if not impossible, for normal-brained journalists to figure out on first principles what's the most important piece of science news in a given week's journal. I mean, there are probably other things that were important, but I also ignored. But so what happens then is we run around after stories that are probably nonsense. Now, the stories of what's nonsense that gets reported are legion, so I'm not going to bore you with one after another of those. But this story, I don't know, does anybody remember this? This was the discovery in a lake in California, or is it Oregon? Anyway, I think it's California, of a bacterium that can grow by using arsenic instead of phosphorus. This is like a whole new form of life. Nobody thought that organisms could do without phosphorus. And I can tell you that, I mean, we all got it. When this paper came out, we all said, whoa, this nobody, I should go back and make the list of how many people got this story. We all got this. This was big news. Except for one thing. It was wrong. And it took a year for other scientists to prove it was wrong, but it was wrong. And even though the stories we did when we first reported on this said this is probably wrong, we still reported on it. And the best way to do, if you ask me, the best way to handle stories that are wrong are not to talk about them. but we talked about them. And that's, again, one of the pitfalls of being in journalism. I mean, I could have looked at this, I probably did look at this and say, no way. But I bet it's going to be in the New York Times, so we better cover it. And I'm not kidding. This is the discussion that goes on in editorial offices around the world, or, well, around America. I've only done America. We are all, you know, trying not to look stupid in front of our bosses because they're the ones that really care. And if something's in the New York Times and it's not on NPR, somebody's going to walk over and ask me why we were asleep and missed this big story. And if you're going to say because it's nonsense, you better be prepared to back that up with a lot of evidence. And then you still probably have to wind up doing the story because they think it's important because it was in the New York Times. Okay, and just so I don't point fingers and say, well, this could never happen to me, I picked this story, which I also looked at and said, whoa, this is fantastic. This is a genome-wide association study from 2010 that appeared in, I don't remember, Nature, Science, one of those. It was a big journal. About a constellation of markers in the genome that could predict who would live to be 100. Only poor peer review cited in retracted DNA study. So, was I wrong to do this story in the first place? Well, it wasn't immediately obvious what they had done wrong, or at least it wasn't immediately obvious to people who didn't know that the particular plate that they were using from the company that manufactured them had a well-known tendency to overestimate the HK19.2 SNP. Right, of course I knew that. I mean, don't be silly. No, I had no idea. That was also, you had to read the supplementary material in order to pick that up. So, missed that one. Okay, so why science becomes news. So I've said to you that the intrinsic importance of science is hard to determine, and often what is science has no particular relationship to the scientific intrinsic importance. Now, I know I'd get an F if I were handing this in as a graph to a statistics course, and so I ask your indulgence because I wasn't very good with PowerPoint. I couldn't figure out how to label the axes. And I also know it's a little hard to see, but you can tell this graph is saying something, and I'll tell you what it's saying. This was a search by me for the number of times in Nexus the phrase BRCA, breast cancer gene, popped up in the media. And on the y-axis, you can see it's by hundreds up to 1,000 hits per month. Oh, and the bottom, it's months of the year, starting in January 2011 and ending in May 2013. So the question is, what was the giant breakthrough in breast cancer research in May 2013 that brought the media to brought BRCA gene to the attention of the media? Does anybody know? Exactly. It was Angelina Jolie and her announcement about having the BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutation and deciding to have a mastectomy. Unrelated to the intrinsic importance, but you can see. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this graph is you see there's a sort of a peak just before the large peak. You know what that is? The Supreme Court decision on myriad genetics and whether BRC was a patentable gene. And the other two things, there are two other smaller peaks, and this should give hope to people who work in public health. The two smaller peaks are Breast Cancer Awareness Month. So there's some good news there, although you're better off with Angelina Jolie. And then, this is just me, I'm very fond of correlations, and so the fact that this graph and this graph look so similar, this is atmospheric ozone in the last 1,000 years and Angelina Jolie. And then because, I'm just saying, and this is the other, so if you haven't already looked at this, I commend to your attention those of you who are amused by such things. There's a guy who has come up with spuriouscorrelations.com, and this is letters in the winning word of Scripps National Spelling Bee and the number of people killed by venomous spiders from 1999. And the correlation, by the way, is 0.80 or 0.81. But even better is the divorce rate in Maine and the per capita consumption of margarine, which has a correlation of 0.99. Now, it's true, we don't know whether the divorce rate is driving the margarine consumption or vice versa, but I leave it to you to think about the importance of those two correlations. So, this is the multimedia part of our event, and I'm going to say right now that if the multimedia doesn't launch properly, I'm going to ask for help. So don't say what a klutz, because I'm already admitting I'm a klutz. But I've worked in science journalism for almost 30 years, and as I tell people now, I've been in the same dead-end job at NPR for 23 years. And I've had two stories with what I would consider to be overwhelming attention. Not just, the story went out, and it wasn't like, oh, that was nice, Joe, but, congressional hearings, investigations, what have you. And the two stories that really, really changed public opinion and attitudes and whatnot, or at least had that kind of impact in my career, had the thing that joins them together is that neither of them had a shred of news. And I just find that kind of amusing. So I've seeded, I've seeded the audience with the knowledge of who this person is. Does anybody, apart from the shills that I've planted, recognize this face? No. Yes.
Richard Seed.
Bravo! That is great. Richard Seed. Does anybody else in this room, besides the people I had dinner with last night, and this gentleman here, know who Richard Seed is? Richard Seed decided in 1998, that he was going to produce the Human Cloning Clinic. Now, give you a little background. Early in 2008, there was a scientific paper in Nature about a sheep named Dolly. Yeah. And Dolly was a clone, so it was a cell taken from an adult female sheep's mammary gland. By the way, did you all know that's why the offspring was named Dolly? Not kidding. Scientists don't have much in the way of sense of humor, but that's their humor. Dolly was a sheep that was born using a mammary gland from an adult sheep that cell was taken and put into an enucleated egg, and the enucleated egg was subsequently put into a host mother, and the sheep that was born was a clone of the sheep from whom the mammary cell was taken. Cloning, right? Well, at the time, there was a lot of immediate, oh my gosh, what does this mean? Are we going to clone human beings? And the president of the United States, Bill Clinton, asked an emergency panel of ethicists to get together. And after studying the questions for 3 months, they basically said, it's probably not safe, so we shouldn't do it right now, which I think is really breaking new ethical ground, and I'm really glad that they brought ethicists in to figure that one out, since it had only worked once in sheep. But the sad truth about reproductive technology in this country is that's usually enough for most reproductive medicine doctors to go ahead and try it in humans. Sorry, that's a little editorial comment. Sorry, cut that. I didn't say it. Anyway, so there was a conference held in Chicago about the social, legal, ethical issues around cloning, and they were mostly talking about the fact that there were a lot more players now in the reproductive debate. There's the sperm donor, the egg donor, the surrogate mother, the adoptive parents, the biological parents. A lot of people come to the table with a legitimate interest in the child that's going to be born. And at the back of the room, this guy stands up and says, I'm going to clone humans and I'm going to do it right now. I'm not waiting. And I don't know if you've ever been at a meeting like this, but usually they're in meetings of cosmologists where somebody comes into the room with a bag full of aluminum cans and tinfoil on his head to protect him from microwave radiation, and he stands up and says, I have a theory of how the universe formed, and the physicists all look around uncomfortably and then go back to their conference. I have a feeling that's kind of what happened when I wasn't there, but one of my colleagues from Minnesota Public Radio went. But he wrote to my editor and said, hey Ann, I saw this guy, and I don't know, he seemed like a nut. And my editor came to me and I said, he's a nut. And she said, check it out. So I went and checked it out, and he sounded pretty round the bend. But, and this is what I mean about reproductive physiologists, he said, I'm working with a clinic here in Chicago, and I've got a fertility doctor who's agreed to try to do this technique. Now, that turns it from, you're crazy and you would never do this, to, well, I mean, the instructions were in the Nature article. I mean, they were specific to sheep, but you could do the same steps with a human. And so I said to Richard Seed, I said, I will come to Chicago and I will consider doing this story if you introduce me to the doctor who says he's going to do this. And after some toing and froing, Richard Seed said, yes, you can come to Chicago and I will introduce you to the doctor. And we had this weird lunch just before we went to the doctor's office where I was thinking, this guy's either going to be the most famous human being in America, and I will never get to sit and have lunch with him again, or this is just the craziest story I've ever been on. Well, anyway, we go across the street and the doctor says, I'm sorry, I'm too busy. His office says, I'm too busy to meet with you. And you've never seen anybody so crestfallen in all his life. But then he goes back and talks to the guy, and the guy comes out and he agrees to talk to me with the understanding that I won't reveal his name because he's worried about bad publicity. I don't know why. Anyway, so I do the story. And I say, the story is not, it just says Richard Seed is going to, it says he wants to clone human beings. He's got a clinic a doctor who says he'll do the procedure. And honest to goodness, right now, there's nobody in the world to stop him. I mean, there's been a lot of hand-wringing, but there's been nobody who says no. So I will now attempt, through the magic of television and radio, to play a bit of that story. I had the thing on the bottom of the screen.
Right now, he doesn't have the money. Practical considerations may prevent Seed from opening his human clone clinic. Right now, he doesn't have the money, he doesn't have a firm commitment from the physicians who must perform the procedure, and he doesn't have an infertile couple willing to undergo the procedure. But Seed says he has faced similar roadblocks in the past with other projects, and he believes he can overcome these. In fact, Seed believes there is a moral imperative to proceed with cloning.
God made man in his own image. God intended for man to become one with God. We are going to become one with God. We are going to have almost as much knowledge and almost as much power as God. Cloning and the reprogramming of DNA is the first serious step in becoming one with God.
Seed says someone will eventually be the first to try human cloning. Seed hopes it will be he. Joe Palca, NPR News, Washington.
I really was just very proud of getting I didn't say it would be him. I was very just because the pedants who listened to NPR would have been all over me. But now, there's two things I did with that piece of tape. First of all, I basically said, pay no attention to this. Well, first of all, I said he's got a snowball's chance in hell. The second thing I did was I played a lot of him talking. And anybody who's ready to invest in his product after hearing that is probably ready to buy the Brooklyn Bridge. But what the rest of the world heard in that story was Richard Seed's going to clone human beings. and the world went nuts. And it was like, we've got to talk to this guy, we've got to interview him. They couldn't find Richard Seed, so they interviewed me on CNN. There were congressional hearings, and then I was absolutely slammed by my colleagues in science media because they said, why did you put this nutcase on the air? And I said, I mean, he's not a nutcase. He's actually an interesting guy, and I don't mean to make light of him. He had some big ideas, and he was a thoughtful guy, but he obviously was a little bit out there. What I said was, I never said he was going to clone anybody. I said he's going to try. And I was also making the point that there was nobody in the federal government or in the state of Illinois or whatever who could stop him at that moment. Well, subsequently, the FDA said, oh, yeah, we could do it because it's a drug, which I always think is hilarious because it's, anyway. It seemed like a stretch to me. But the point is, there was no news in that. And it had enormous implications. And so, again, picking the science news, I guess I should be proud of that. I have one other example. I'll just give it to you quickly because, let's see. Oh, I have to do this. There we go. This one, maybe I don't even have to play the clip because I want to give some time for questions. So I'll simply tell you that this one was... I was in the head office of the guy who was running the Mars rover Curiosity, which landed on Mars in 2012, right? Or yes, 2012. And I had been told through a various series of tittle-tattle people who said you can't say you know this, but I knew this, that they had found an exciting signal in one of the SCOOP samples that the Mars rover had just picked up, and they had analyzed it once, and the day I was there, they were getting a second set of results that would confirm or deny the first example. And when my tape recorder stopped in the middle of the recording, and the guy who I was interviewing, because I had to change batteries, and so he jumped up and looked at his screen, and I turned my tape recorder back on. He said, what are you looking at? And he said, oh, we're getting some, he wouldn't tell me. He said, oh, we're getting some really interesting data. I mean, this is going to be one for the history books. And I said, and he said, yeah, I know, I'm killing you. And then he said he would tell me if I'd sign a non-disclosure agreement, which I can't sign because that's not what I do. Anyway, so I argued with my editor. I said, look, I know what he's got, but I just can't get anybody to confirm it officially. And she said, you can't do the story then. And so we wound up doing a story that says, well, as you see, big news from Mars, rover scientists mum for now. And what we agreed to do is to do a story about the process of science. What happens when you get a science result that's really exciting, but it's premature, and you don't want to talk about it yet. And, that happens all the time, and people find things out, and then they get excited, and then they don't, and it goes away. So that's the story I did. Well, once again...
The lead scientist for the Mars rover mission is John
Once again,
I interviewed him in
the world went nuts. NASA... No, I'm not going to play the tape. NASA went nuts. The internet went nuts with people covering this because all people heard was NASA found something exciting on Mars and they're not going to tell us what it is. And this guy got death threats. I mean, you found life on Mars. It was horrible. And I collected some of the websites, and the only thing I liked about it is that that's the only word on this page I know. So it was an international phenomenon and had no news. So, I mean, I've sort of lived through these wars, and I'll just end you with, so what I've decided to do is this project called Joe's Big Idea, which if you all have your cell phones now, take them out, go to your Facebook account, go to Joe's Big Idea page, and hit like. There, can I be any more clear than that? The Facebook is part of this effort, but it's basically me saying I'm done with trying to guess what the big story is, and I'm done trying to tell you about things that are not important. I'm done. I mean, I am going to tell you about things that aren't important because that's what most of science is. I mean, forgive me, but science is incremental, and from a news standpoint, most of what's done is not important. Having said that, most of what's done is also very interesting and worth telling other people about and worth getting excited about and worth hearing about. And the process of science, getting from A to B or getting answers, is really what science is all about, not the answers themselves. Now, you guys, the rubber hits the road. You have to do something about the Zika virus. You have to tell people how to change their behavior. I get that. So I'm not saying there's not a time when you want to be more directive in your coverage, but I'm talking about science stories, and the intrinsic science is usually very unrelated to the extrinsic world that we live in. And so I'm just doing stories that I think are interesting, and that's what NPR is letting me do with this Joe's Big Idea. And I'll tell you the story of Joe's Big Idea if somebody asks. But the big idea is talk about science as a process instead of as a series of results. And I'm really thrilled that they're letting me do it. They want me to do more social media, and if that's what keeps my job, I'll do it. But I'm really pleased and proud of my news organization for letting me have the headroom to try this. I don't think I'm going to change the world of media, but it's a start. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Joe. So we do have some time for questions. If you'll use the microphone so that people online can hear your question, and also I think Cliff, we may have some questions. Some questions online as well. So we'll be shouting those out as they come through. So I'm just going to step away and let's see who has something to ask.
You want to know what Susan Stamberg really looks like?
Yeah.
Hi, Leslie Greenwald. I'm an economist. And I wonder if some of this problem is something that we scientists do to ourselves. And let me give you the reason I asked or I propose that. We do a lot of social science. We do a lot of really interesting policy-forward projects. And just recently, a few of us in management engaged in an initiative where we got some of our folks who work on some of our bigger projects and said, let's write a little issue paper. Let's write something that says, what does this mean? All the work that you've been doing, give me a couple of pages on what does this mean. And we thought this would be easy peasy. No, we took some of the smartest people we know on some of the biggest projects we had, and we said to them, write me a page on why this is important. And in some cases, we're on draft 10.
Yeah.
Yeah, or they gave us 20 pages.
Right. I think it's always a good idea to be able to put your reason for what you're doing into a sentence or two. But that also has its pitfalls, because when you apply for an NIH grant, for example, somewhere you say, we're doing this because we think it'll help us cure cancer, or we think it'll help us develop new drugs for diseases. And what happens when the media get hold of it is they say, new drug for diseases or cure for cancer. So I don't think it's really scientists' fault. I mean, I think it's important for them to be able to articulate why they're doing and why it's important. But you have to be aware that what makes it important in the big picture may not be what it actually is doing in the small picture. And then you have to take the process in aggregate. And that's a tough thing. But I do think I think it's helpful in terms of communicating to the public to say, for more people to say, and I won't have to say it so often, look, this is really interesting. I mean, I feel bad that you can't just write to the National Institutes of Health and say, this is really going to help us understand biology. Because they say, well, we're the National Institutes of Health. We want to help people live longer or healthier. And I think that's a shame, because the truth is most of the research isn't going to do that. And does that mean that research was a waste of money? No. So, yes, there's a question over here.
I'm staring at your Joe's Big Ideas, and just really curious. I see 90% response time, 6-hour response rate. So are you learning from folks posting comments? Are you learning about big ideas?
I'm sorry. One of the rules about being in the media, never read the comments. Unless you want to find out what an idiot you are, or be reassured that you're a total idiot, or be reminded that you don't know anything about grammar or human experience or science. The people, no, there's not, I mean, the 90% response rate is that 3 people wrote, and I wrote back to all of them, or 2.8 of them.
So are you trying to get ideas from the public about science that they think is important, or what's your goal here?
Okay, well, so the goal with the Joe's Big Idea is, so does anybody know the website IFL Science? Okay, I'm not going to, like we didn't talk about it. I'm going to keep this clean. Anyway, it's a website that's wildly popular because it has like really amazing science stories. I'm trying to do a slightly, a more thoughtful version of that. And I'm trying to get science things that are interesting, but not ridiculous. So what I did was I created this Joe's Big Idea, and I had this idea. This was me trying to think, how do I get this done without doing too much work? I thought maybe what I could do is recruit young scientists who were interested in communicating science to help me find interesting content to post on my website. And so I created something called Friends of Joe's Big Idea, or FOJOBI. And what I was hoping, there are now about 120. We had a really successful recruiting day down here at ComSciCon, this conference I was at, and I was also at UNC on Friday. Got a lot of recruits. These are people who want to get better at science communication. They're mostly grad students, and I need people to help me find interesting content, and they're always looking around or writing or creating or doing a podcast or doing something. So I link to that, or I link to stuff like other things, and then the payback for them, which is right now, is the ones who want to go on in journalism can say on their resume, worked with Joe Palca on his big idea. And it's honest, but you do need to have some media experience to get your toe in the door most of the time, and this is a sort of an easy way to do it. So, and I'm hoping, I'm working with a grad student now who's on an internship with me, and she's very keen because she would like this, and I think it'd be great, to become a community of people who are like-minded in terms of wanting to communicate science, can support each other, can promote each other's work using, I mean, my website doesn't have that many people on it now, or this Facebook page, but we did this ridiculous thing last week where I walked on a carton of eggs, and we went from, 4,000 people looking at the page to 200,000. Seriously. And I mean, if I can attract that kind of audience and we can put interesting content up there, then maybe we'll build a community and build a set of readers. That's what it's about. Up here? Don has a question.
Right, so most of us in this room are researchers, and I think a lot of us are actually reluctant to be in the media because we realize that our work is, first of all, is incremental. It takes a long time for things to happen. We also know the story behind it. We know all the nuances, the different alternative explanations, the things that we need to continue to explore, and so forth. And so we're hopeful that in our 40 or 50 year career that there might be one or two papers or stories that could get out there that would be that important. We all live, and this is no criticism, but we all work in organizations that very much like to have us in public. And so we've got now programs around how do we get our ideas out to the media? How do we help people see, because everybody else is doing it. If you're from Duke or California or wherever, your science is in the media every day in some way. So do you have any suggestions for organizations that want to take a responsible approach to this, but yet also really want to reach out and share information that they have?
Well, I mean, again, there's something that's happened over the course of my career, which was, when I started out, you either had to have a printing press or broadcast tower because that was the only way you were going to reach a lot of people. And now you've got the internet and you can reach as many people as I ever could in 5 minutes. The problem is getting somebody on the other end to look at it. So that's the good news and the bad news there. But in terms of getting visibility on NPR, New York Times, BuzzFeed, you name the thing, build relationships. When you see an article that you like, better ones that you like, but if you see one that you think is intriguing, especially if you like it, write to the author and say, next time this rolls onto your plate, I got something that would be really helpful. Or, hey, that was really good and I'm glad you're covering this. And, from my perspective, you got this a little bit wrong and here's why. I mean, to the extent that journalists are thoughtful, caring people, which I won't say they all are, but neither are all scientists, so I'll be generous. I think that works. And so people who know me and call me with a story, I do the stories if they're good or if I have time or if it's interesting. It's much more likely. And I think people forget, they hire public affairs people and they run, but nobody has time to make these calls. Nobody has. We're all up against it. But I can tell you that what really works is the personal connection. And now you can all write to me, jpalca@npr.org. I say this at meetings with the certain knowledge that I'm not going to get that many emails because people just don't. They all say they want to, but they don't. That's okay. And the other thing is I have no trouble saying no. I look at email, I say, yeah, that's interesting. I'm no thanks. But the chances that I'll say yes go up immeasurably if you ask. Anybody else? Maybe one more. Maybe one more. Right. Well, I can do it.
Thank you again, Bill. So I believe there are evaluation forms in your chairs. If you'll do Joe's reimbursement, it depends on how well you do. So if you'll complete your evaluation form, and those of you online, there's a way for you to download